Movement at last. A one-way journey out of lockdown will soon be underway, according to Boris Johnson. A noticeably quick start in the next 2 weeks for schools in England, and then into a slower lane for the wider opening up of society. The first stop on what the Prime Minister calls his one-way road to liberation will come 2 weeks today, when all schools in England will fully open. Two people from separate households will also be able to meet outside for a coffee. 3 weeks later, people will be able to meet outside in groups of 6 or 2 households. The stay-at-home order will be lifted, though people will be asked to work from home. From this point, there will be a step-by-step opening up over 3 dates, with a 5-week gap in between if a series of tests on vaccinations and hospitalisation levels are met. No earlier than the 12th of April, non-essential retail shopping and hairdressers will open. Pubs and restaurants will be able to serve outside, and holiday lets will open for members of the same household. No earlier than the 17th of May, people will be able to meet indoors in groups of 6 or 2 households, including in pubs and restaurants. Most restrictions on meeting outdoors will be lifted, subject to a limit of 30. No earlier than Midsummer's Day, the government hopes to lift all legal limits on social contact. All going well, nightclubs will finally reopen.
Of relaxations in restrictions.
Setting out that timetable, the buoyant Prime Minister of last spring, who had hoped to send the virus packing in 12 weeks, was replaced by Captain Cautious.
The Chief Medical Officer is clear that moving any faster would mean acting before we know the impact of each step, which would increase the risk of us having to reverse course and reimpose restrictions. I won't take that risk.
Inevitably, for each one of these steps, we are taking a risk which is an accepted risk. There is a risk to this, and everybody in the country, I'm sure, understands this. And what we want to do is, after each set of risks with a particular set of opening up, wait until we have data that tells us, has this done what we expected it to do? Have we actually ended up in a slightly worse place than we thought we would? Or have indeed we ended up in a slightly better place?
The slow pace is frustrating some senior Conservatives.
Look, it would be churlish to pour scorn on what's been announced today. I'm delighted that there is a pathway out of lockdown, but it does seem slow, and a lot of businesses just don't have the time. They just don't have the time. They don't have the cash left to make it many more weeks, and perhaps 7 weeks before they open, and that is of most concern.
But teachers' leaders are alarmed by the timetable for opening up schools.
A safe school reopening could be being sacrificed because the Prime Minister is under such pressure from the COVID recovery group, from his own backbench MPs, to open up the rest of the economy. And so because schools have to be the first to open, he has to do this big bang opening on the 8th of March so that he can get the plan rolling. But I'm afraid that he is in danger of destroying the very thing he wants to happen, because if school reopening increases the R rate above 1, then the whole of the rest of the exit from lockdown is jeopardised. And that's what the Prime Minister is playing with.
A late winter start to a journey that is meant to herald happier times by midsummer. Progress will depend on the science, but an uneasy Conservative Party is watching warily over the Prime Minister.
Nick Watt, and Nick is with me here. Nick, we keep hearing, we keep seeing it is a very delicate balance, this. A rather sobering reflection, nonetheless, from Chris Whitty today on the effect that this will have on deaths.
That's right. I mean, you heard Chris Whitty in my film there saying that there are risks in opening up. He then went on to say that even with these very careful measures, he said there will be a surge in cases and the R rate will creep up towards 1. But he says that there are 2 big factors that are very helpful on that. The vaccinations, he says, will sort of take the heavy load, and that will push the natural R rate down. And obviously, older people will have much greater protection. But caution is the watchword. He said that if we moved really fast right now, there would be a rapid surge and a very noticeable increase in deaths because we have incomplete protection at the moment from vaccination. But just to get an idea of the influence of the scientists on the government, the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies did a series of models, and one of their big recommendations, you saw the Prime Minister saying a 5-week gap between the various dates. Here it is in their document. Several weeks between steps are required to determine if that change has significantly increased transmission.
Nick, where are we politically? Is there broadly agreement with what's been announced today, not least from the government's own backbenchers?
Well, there is unease in the Conservative Party, unease that the Prime Minister says he's going to be driven by data, not dates. And then what we got today were a series of dates, which in the view of the Conservative Party had really very scant, not specific detail on what the thresholds will be that then would allow him to ease the lockdown. And the fear amongst those Conservative MPs, they're saying, look, we think the Prime Minister's been captured by the scientists who, in their view, keep on shifting the goalposts. Now, there will have to be a vote before Easter to sort of renew the lockdown measures. There's talk of a rebellion, but the thinking is it won't be on such a high level that the Prime Minister would have to rely on Labour votes. But the SAGE group, they have an answer to the Coronavirus Recovery Group, who want all the legal restrictions gone by the end of April. They say it is highly likely that hospital occupancy would be higher than that seen in January 2021 if all restrictions are lifted by the start of May. One final interesting thing today, we had a lot of opposition from the government to vaccine passports. The Prime Minister announced today that he is going to be launching a review into COVID status certificates. And at his press conference tonight, he said you're probably going to need them for international travel. But looking at using them in the domestic economy, lots of very difficult ethical issues to be looked at there.
Nick, thanks very much indeed. Well, joining us now, Professor Sir Mark Walport, former Chief Scientific Advisor to the government, the Conservative backbencher Joy Morrissey, who's been pushing for the opening up of schools, and Michael George, Chairman of Amber Taverns, group of more than 150 pubs right across the UK. Joy, can I just start with you? Are you one of those who thinks that the PM's been captured by the scientists, or is this broadly the right pace of change for you?
Well, I'm delighted that he is committed to opening up schools on the 8th of March. I think parents and children are at breaking point, and to see that firm commitment is what I was looking for. So I'm delighted.
And when you hear people saying, well, it's data, not dates, but actually the only thing that people were listening to today were the dates, they will be taking those dates to heart now, whatever the government says, won't they?
I'll be taking the date of the 8th of March to heart, but I think we needed those dates for a bit of hope. I think this has been a very long final lockdown. People are exhausted, and hearing from children and from parents groups, they're at breaking point. The emotional toll that lockdown has taken on families needs to be addressed, and the best way to do that is to allow for children to go back to school on the 8th of March.
Michael George, you've got your own date today as a pub owner, May the 17th. Does that sound too soon, not soon enough? Does it give you optimism?
Well, I think certainly having in the outline of a plan is a good thing. We have a bit more clarity than we did. If the lockdown, the whole pandemic has taught us anything, as you have discussed, it's that we need to be prudent. So there's clearly a balance. I think that it's a little bit suboptimal. You do have a very large industry which is on its knees, and there are some big, I think, some very potent economic and social care reasons why we need to open as quickly as possible. For me, it's a little bit illogical, between the 17th of May versus the 12th of April. It's a little bit illogical and perhaps touch inaccurate to delay until that second date, stage 3. But of course, there's a balance.
When you heard Charles Walker in Nick's piece a moment ago say some businesses just don't have the time or the cash left, do you think that applies to the pub industry?
It does apply to the pub industry. You know, it's predominantly made up of small businessmen and women, entrepreneurs who are operating their own individual businesses. Therefore, it makes it very hard. And there is a significant issue, for example, in starting back up again. Where are they going to get the working capital to do that? And which is, of course, why there are calls for continued support for the industry, for those small entrepreneurs, who, by the way, in aggregate, make up a massive part of our economy. Hospitality is our third biggest employer. There's 3.2 million people directly employed in the sector, and it pays 40 billion. That's a fifth of the government's total tax take. So it is a massive industry made up of predominantly small entrepreneurs, and they do need help to survive.
And Mark Walport, sort of pulling against that is what we've just heard from Chris Whitty, that we will see deaths rise. I guess what we have therefore accepted is that there is an acceptable amount. There is an equation here, and we are prepared for that to happen, are we?
Well, we are used to influenza, which comes every winter. It kills, on average, somewhere between 5,000 and 20,000 people outside pandemics, and we live with nasty infectious diseases. But I think what's clear is that at the moment, there are still a large number of people who are non-immune, have not been vaccinated, and indeed, the vaccine deployment is the first of the 4 tests that the government have outlined. And indeed, over 50-year-olds will not have completed the offer, as it were, the first 9 groups until the middle of April. And it will take about a month for that first dose to be having near its maximum effect. So the job of the science is to give the data, the evidence. And one really good piece of news today was the news emerging from what's happening in the real world as the vaccine is rolled out, with the finding in Scotland that where over 1 million people have been vaccinated, that both the Oxford AZ vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, and the Pfizer-BioNTech are highly protective against people ending up in hospital with coronavirus. And indeed, with that one dose, over 80-year-olds seem to be as well protected as under 80-year-olds. So that's really good news indeed.
And that is cause for optimism, Joy Morrissey. I mean, it's fantastic news. I guess the worry with tests is that they all sound a little bit made up, whether it's 5 tests for the euro or, 6 tests for Keir Starmer's Brexit rules. They can be deliciously ambiguous. And actually, we don't really know if they're serving a data test or a sort of political fudge.
Well, I'm hopeful that it is meant to mirror the level of vaccine rollout, which we've seen to be very successful. And as was said previously, it should mirror the level of the government's commitment to have all adults vaccinated by July. So as I would imagine that it's meant to coincide with the opening up of our society at the same time we have a higher level of vaccination across the country so that it's safe for a greater number of the population to open up as we allow for the restrictions to be lifted. So the two things are happening in parallel.
And I guess, Mark Walport, the schools are, in a sense, they are absolutely necessary, but they are also our guinea pig. If schools reopen and we do see a rise, does the next stage get pushed down, or do the schools shut again? I mean, what do you see as being the way out there?
Well, I think it depends on the scale of the rise. And I think the real point here is that the data will be monitored absolutely continuously. We know that some transmission increase will happen with children going back to school, but also we know that it's an enormously high priority. And it's important that people keep to the other rules as well. And it does make complete sense not, as it were, to change everything at once. If you change one thing at a time or a small number of things, then you can actually attribute change to the changes in infection to the changes in social distancing. And
if things slip, Joy, I mean, you've heard from Michael, if the date for the pubs or the dates for the salons or the dates for the nightclubs eventually in June or whatever keep slipping back, what do you think will happen? Is the public or even small businesses, are they going to leap ahead?
I believe that if we keep with the vaccination schedule that we have committed to, we will be allowing for the R rate to decrease. And as was mentioned previously, we're seeing wonderful success with the level of hospital admissions going down for those that have been vaccinated. So if we're protecting the hospital for NHS capacity with hospital beds, the vaccination process should go a long way in doing that so that we can open up the economy and society safely and permanently.
Michael George, you've had pubs shut, I'm guessing, for more than 6 months now. What do you think it's going to look like? What do you think the whole industry is going to look like when it does reopen? I mean, do you think we're going to find half the pubs gone or unable to sustain themselves or reinventing? What do you expect to see?
Well, on the macro level, 10 years ago, there were 60,000 pubs. Now we're below 40,000 and we're heading to 30,000 very quickly, partly as a result of the pandemic. That's the macro picture. That, of course, affects many communities who have lost hospitality units, which is a serious thing culturally and in social terms for those communities. On the micro level, I think one of the frustrations is that perhaps sometimes when, for instance, MPs think about pubs, they forget the considerable work that was done last year. Speaking from my own experience, if you go to a pub, it has invested heavily in screens, in PPE, in ventilation, in table service. And what you are seeing is socially distanced and disciplined operators, which, in my view, are COVID safe.
Yeah.
That needs to be remembered, because that is the reality in which we are trying to get back into operation as quickly as possible.
So they've been through this, I guess, in the summer, and clearly, you know, it wasn't enough for what had to happen. When you look at, Mark Walport, the Oxford Blavatnik, the School of Government, graph today suggesting that we have the most stringent government lockdown in the world of you know, the most economically developed countries. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, the truth is that we've had a very nasty wave recently, and but we also know that the current lockdown is working. But the other factor, which you mentioned right at the beginning, of course, is the variation in the virus. And as the virus adapts to us, and it will adapt, and immune evasion will occur, then we have to, in turn, adapt ourselves. And the other big change is the fact that we have this extraordinary ability to genotype the virus so that we can genetically identify when it changes. And so test, trace, isolate will be very important. And it's another reason for wanting to get cases right down, because that way you can find new clusters easily. And it's been clear that there may potentially have to be local level measures, quite tight ones, if new clusters emerge.